Now let's turn our attention to the history of pediatrics in the military. Our next speaker is Dr. Charles Callahan, Jr. Dr. Callahan is the Vice President of Population Health at the University of Maryland Medical Center and is a retired Army colonel and physician executive. He has received numerous teaching awards, has lectured broadly on leadership and the culture of excellence in medicine, is the author of more than 100 abstracts, articles, books, and book chapters on leadership and medicine, and has been awarded more than $2 million in research grants on asthma, telemedicine, and population health. Please welcome Dr. Charles Callahan, who will be discussing History of Pediatrics in the Military, a look back as we leap forward.
Well, good morning. You probably get tired of hearing this, but it is an honor for me to be here today. So thank you very much for having me. I have nothing to disclose. My wife would think this slide is comical because she would want to make sure that my financial disclosure includes the fact that we didn't balance our checkbook for the first 19 years of our marriage. And the fact that we put 7 kids through college with a great deal of challenge. So I have nothing to disclose other than those things. The lecture is titled History of, and you either like history or you don't like history. And if you don't like history, this is the time you go to get coffee. If you do like history, in particular if you're interested in the history of uniform pediatrics, there's a number of great papers that have come out in the past several years that summarize a lot of the details that I intend to talk about today. And would be a great place and a great point for you to go back to if you wanted to get more information. But I want to take this opportunity to reframe this conversation a little bit and maybe really even retitle it to talk about history, our heritage, and then maybe to offer a little bit of hope, things that perhaps American healthcare can learn from uniform pediatrics. My bias is that I spent 30 years wearing an Army uniform. Since before I could shave, the beard has actually delayed adolescence. And that means that I worked for a single-payer system for all that period of time. So my bias is towards really a single payer in a system like that. How do we even get into this business of uniform pediatricians and caring for the children of military family members? We didn't need to until a certain set of circumstances came to be in American history. And that is, for the first time in our history, when we had a standing military, sometime after the Mexican-American War, after the Civil War, during the war against the Native American people, we had a standing military. They were put on distant posts, and they had a frontier to guard. And I'd like to propose that that theme recurs all through this history, and I want to pick up 7 dates that were important in understanding dependent history and the care of military dependents as we went forward. When the military was posted to the far west, one observer said that wives accompanied their husbands, slept in tents, had babies, a good many babies, and were cared for by military physicians in that setting. So much so that the 1884 Defense Appropriation Act directed that military medical officers and contract surgeons will whenever practicable, not charge the families of military officers and enlisted. Fast forward to World War II, America has come through the Depression. 9 to 10 million Americans are on the move, and when military members are drafted, their families follow them to posts. So much so that at Fort Lewis in Washington State, the post commander cried out to the state officials and later to federal officials for support in caring for the many families that had come to the area, leading to the first federal dollars that were applied to health care in 1943, health care of military dependents. After World War II in Korea, with military stationed overseas, more than 1 million military members remained in uniform, 300,000 of them overseas, and perhaps 40% of them not within military contact with military facilities. And so in 1956, Eisenhower signed the Dependent Medical Care Act that made military benefits and health care benefits available for all military dependents. The cost of ambulatory care became such that it began to overwhelm the system, and we reached out to our civilian colleagues. Many of you are still in the room caring for military family members, with the Civilian Health and Medical Program of the Uniformed Services, or CHAMPUS, that came to be in 1966. 2 years later, it was extended to retirees and their family members, something for which I am continually thankful, and it became the CHAMPUS program. The costs accelerated rapidly, and in another effort to contain costs in the mid-'80s, a number of contract clinics were developed by the Army and the Navy that were called the Primary Clinics of the Uniformed Services, or Primus, and NavCare from the Navy. Contracted clinics providing ambulatory care and specialty care in some cases to military children and dependents. A number of CHAMPUS reform initiatives took place over the next several years. The CRIs, they were called, for those of us that remember them, that led up to the early 90s. Managed care had also come onto the scene, and so Congress caught on to this and directed that the military come up with a solution for managed care, and the 1993 Federal Defense Appropriation Act directed that by 1994, to be implemented by 97, there would be a TRICARE program in place that would enable military children to be cared for in a continuous way in the civilian community as well as in the military. Go forward a little bit to 2011, and we have the first of a series of hospitals that were built specifically to be community hospitals that integrated family care, obstetric care, pediatric care with adult care, and a close tie to the civilian community. This is the Fort Belvoir Community Hospital in Northern Virginia, my last duty assignment, and we'll mention it again in a few minutes. But in the Washington area also, the National Capital Region Medical became what is now the Defense Health Agency, which, according to the current Defense Appropriation Act, will soon take over running all of the military hospitals in the country. This history leads to a proud heritage, and as long as America has sent soldiers to war, it has also sent physicians with them, beginning perhaps with Dr. Stephen Kelly on the top left of your screen, who was a pediatrician and pediatric surgeon who volunteered for the Spanish-American War, and when he came back, wrote the first textbook, or one of the first, in pediatric surgery. Since then, pediatricians have served proudly in World War I, World War II, Korea, Vietnam, and to a very large degree in the current war, that is the longest war fought by volunteers in American history, unless we forget we've been at war for 16 years. I apologize for this next slide that it has so many pictures of me, but I was so proud to be there in theater with many of my former residents. I also have no pictures of the residents that didn't involve Iraqi or Afghanistan children, and I didn't want to put them up there without their specific permission. But this heritage and this presence is something that we all remember, and if I would have time, well, let me ask by a show of hands very quickly, how many people in this room have deployed at one time or another over the last 16 years? And you can see a show of hands if you look around. Pediatricians in the United States should be very proud of these men and women, and this is an occasion for us to remember that as we meet here in Chicago, members of the American Academy of Pediatrics are in Afghanistan and Iraq even now. It's also important, and you may not be aware of the fact that early in the war in particular, the third most deployed specialty of all the specialties in the Army Medical Department were pediatricians, who deployed as battalion surgeons and healthcare administrators. An important point I think that's lost as soon as we get away from conflicts like this. Today, the American healthcare system, the American military healthcare system is across the globe, and uniformed pediatricians care for the children of dependent service members all around the world. There are three things about uniformed pediatrics and three things about our healthcare system that I believe American healthcare can learn from. I've been out of the military 3 years and in civilian healthcare, or what we would call civilian healthcare, for the past 2 years, and there are three things that are distinguishable about uniformed care that I want to just highlight very quickly. First is that it's longitudinal. 40% of tomorrow's military are in today's uniformed services, pediatric and family medicine clinics, as best we can estimate. First-degree relatives who raise up children that then become service members as well. And as an example, in the center here is Colonel Mark Burnett, perhaps the most deployed of all of our Army pediatricians. That's his father to the left from World War II, his great-grandfather from the Spanish-American War, and his young son who just started as a West Point cadet this fall. So a longitudinal healthcare system that cares for people, and eventually the interventions we make in adolescent medicine today could impact the Veterans Administration in 30, 40, or 50 years. The second thing about the healthcare system is that it is integrated. And here I want to draw on the example that I talked about a few minutes ago, the Fort Belvoir Community Hospital, my last duty station. We had 100,000 military dependents enrolled in primary care, patient-centered medical homes. We had 250,000 specialty patients that would derive their care from that hospital, all integrated into what we called a medical neighborhood, all devoted to the same population, the health and well-being of that population. And just very quickly, without going through all the details, you can see the way the hospital is laid out, a 1.3 million square foot facility. And on your far right side, you see that pediatricians and pediatric subspecialists are nested together in that same integrated approach to healthcare in what was at the time the largest LEED Gold healthcare facility in the world, and really the world's best example at the time of evidence-based design. The idea that the built environment can improve the outcome of healthcare individuals or patients in a healthcare setting. Let me draw from another example of what integrated healthcare can do. Back from my time as a pediatric pulmonologist and intensivist at Tripler Army Medical Center, the new clinical practice guidelines in asthma had just come out, and we began to attempt to move away from oral albuterol. Does anyone remember oral albuterol for asthma, or sub-Q suspirin? We moved away from that towards inhaled corticosteroids, and the first graph is a graph of change in practice in the medical center. But very importantly, it wasn't just in the medical center, but by standardizing the approach to MDI so that everyone taught the MDI the same way and had the same clinical practice guidelines that were implemented. We were also able to change the way pediatric asthma was cared for in the family medicine clinics as well. And Schofield Barracks is one of our large family medicine clinics at the time. And this had, as you might imagine, the predictable change in hospitalization. The rise in hospitalization on the left side is when pediatric pulmonologists and asthma experts first arrived at Tripler, began to identify the high rate. The clinical practice guideline came in the 90s. There's a drop in the hospitalization rate, and then a gradual rise again as we began to awaken to the fact that a lot of the infants that we were calling recurrent bronchiolitis and so forth also had asthma. And as we looked in a separate paper at the rise on the tail end, and those were younger children. But this is not that unique, because I think in many of your practices during that same period of time, you recognized the same kinds of opportunities with inhaled corticosteroids in the treatment of asthma. But it's not true everywhere in the United States. And in the bottom right side, you see the current asthma hospitalization rates for the city where I now live, in Baltimore. And you can see that the inner city hospitalization rate is 5 times the national average. In the state of Maryland, it's twice the national average. So there's a great deal of opportunity, and that leads to my last point, and that is uniform pediatric health care is equitable. In 1992, Jim Rollins and Mike Weir published a paper where they looked at infant mortality rate for biracial groups within a population of 15,000 children delivered over 5 years at Madigan Army Medical Center. At the time, the mortality rate for black infants in the United States was 17.9 per thousand, and they demonstrated in that population, as you can see, 11.10. There was no statistical difference between the mortality rate for black and white infants in that community when you controlled for socioeconomics, and you had a population where everyone had a job, everyone had a house, and everyone had access to health care. The difference in the bottom right shows you that within that population of black infants, there was a greater degree of preterm delivery, low birth weight, and length of hospital stay as a consequence. And so Dr. Rawlings and his colleagues went on to look at a paper that was published in the journal New England Journal that for the first time perhaps recognized that interpartum distance, the distance between the timing of pregnancies, was a predictor for low birth weight, and perhaps more a matter of culture than it was race all along. This fast forward to Baltimore, where I live. This is 2015, after the uprising in Baltimore, and depending on your perspective, it was a riot, it was a disturbance, or it was an uprising. But to the people of Baltimore, it was an uprising. And here are statistics that came out about Baltimore around the time of the uprising. The life expectancy, black versus white, 2 times higher mortality rate for black infants in the city, and you can see the burden of disease for black adults, a lifetime of not having access to care, and the socioeconomics of depression and poverty in the city. If you look at it another way, for those of us in Baltimore, this is the white L and the black butterfly, the white L and the butterfly. The white that you can see in the middle is where the white people live in Baltimore, and the red on either side is a density of greater than 65% black. Baltimore has the reputation among all the cities in the United States of having the most restrictive racial laws that were put in place at the end of the 19th and the earliest 20th century. At the end of the Civil War, it was an integrated city. And this is the way the city is today. And it's not an accident. It's the way laws were constructed and conditions were created. And look at the difference between mortality and life expectancy in the upper arm of what we call the white L, life expectancy of 83 years in contrast to 63 years in the neighborhoods surrounding the University of Maryland Medical Center, and an infant mortality that, at least by these data, was almost 3 times higher. Now, a lot of progress has been made by the current health commissioner to lower infant mortality through Be More for Healthy Babies, and you can read about that online. So there are things that can be done, but this is the stark reality of a system that is not equitable, where healthcare disparity is very clearly a part of the way things are done. Now, you can do the same thing again and normalize in those neighborhoods for socioeconomic conditions, and you find out that a lot of the racial differences sort of disappear. That these differences are a matter of socioeconomics, and socioeconomics has a lot to do with the reflection of the system and the way things have evolved. And so this last statement gives us hope that these are not necessarily inherent things, but every day in Baltimore there are 24 babies born. 16 are black, 6 to 8 are white, and then there's a smattering of other groups. What would it take for those 24 babies to grow up and have the same opportunity for health and well-being, regardless of the race that they came from? And that's the question, I think, for population health. It's the question for us as pediatricians, as we learned from a lot of the plenary sessions yesterday. These are some of the families we have the privilege of caring for in Uniformed Pediatricians, and I'll circle back there again. On the left of the Cools family, they arrived at Walter Reed the same weekend I arrived as the Chief Medical Officer at Walter Reed in 2005. Ryan Cools, pictures used by permission, I might add, was injured in an improvised explosive device, lost his arm and his leg. That's his wife. They had only been married a short period of time when he went overseas. And when Ryan Cools was extubated somewhere around Christmas of 2005, the first question that he asked is, what happened to my men? That's the privilege of the population we have to care for. On the right side is one of my neighbors, the Mays family. That's Bill Mays and his family. And Bill was on his way to Afghanistan that morning, and I asked if I could take a picture of the family, and later asked if I could use it on occasions like this. Bill was so intent on making sure that each one of his children knew that he was leaving and that he loved them individually, that when he got to his deployment site at Schofield Barracks, he sheepishly called his wife back and asked her if there was a pile of white things on the piano stool. And she said, yeah, they're there. And he said, well, those are the armor plates for my armored vest. Do you think you could ship them to me? I'm pretty sure that his armored vest caught up with him. But that's the nature of the people that we have the privilege of taking care of. In 2009, Simon Sinek wrote a book that I recommend to all of you called Start With Why. And one of the things that characterize Uniformed Pediatricians is that we never lose sight of why. Why is the Cools family, and why is the Mays family, and many families like them. And one of the themes that comes out to us at meetings like this is that pediatricians understand why. It's for the health of the children. And when we talk about large systems and we talk about large changes that need to be taken, that need to be made, it's with the why in mind. It's with the last child we had the privilege of caring for. So, through history and heritage, I believe that we can offer hope. And that hope has everything to do with the fact that these men and women represent the very best of pediatrics, both in the United States and around the world. And there is hope that the system that they are a part of can make a very clear point of how very good American healthcare can be for all of our children. Thank you very much.